various orientations. So when you do a tensile test on a single crystal, it will come out looking like it's deformed uniformly. If, however, you etch it and look at it carefully or start out with a very highly polished surface, you can see the individual slip planes just in X's, and they're really dead now, uniform X's up and down the length of the bar. And the net effect of all those slip planes operating is a fairly uniform elongation. Deformation of a polycrystal. Most of the materials we care about are polycrystals, and their deformation gets a little bit more complicated because, of course, even if every grain in the material is the same, so the critical resolve shear stress is the same for every grain, their orientations are different. They will be randomly oriented in a random polycrystal. So suppose we load up the material. Nothing is going to happen until, and let's assume that the material is completely relaxed, it's under no internal stresses at all, which is a very rare situation for reasons I'll tell you in just a minute. Nothing is going to happen until the shear stress in the most favorably oriented grain on the most favorably oriented plane comes to exceed the critical resolve shear stress. When that happens, dislocations will begin to move on that plane, but only in that crystal. They hit the grain boundary, they got no place to go, so you'll tend to change the shape of that grain by itself. Well, if I have a bunch of grains stuck together, and I change the shape of one of them, and they remain stuck together, then that's going to put stresses on all the grains around them. So very shortly after I get that initial deformation, the stress is going to build up in adjacent grains. So you can imagine a polycrystal, deformation of a polycrystal is being kind of like a percolation phenomenon. Within the polycrystal, starting out, I get deformation of a few grains. Those few grains stress the grains around them, so the deformation, the deformed region tends to grow a little bit. Well, I'm growing a little region here, a little region here, a little region here, and before long, they can interconnect so that the entire sample is beginning to deform. And that's the way deformation builds up in a polycrystal, and that's part of the reason that you see the gradual onset of plastic deformation. Well, now let's suppose that I've deformed the polycrystal, for example, in forming it. If I deformed this polycrystal previously, then inside the polycrystal I have all of these grains that have been deformed and stressed the grains around them, and they can't fully relax. To fully relax, all of the grains would have to relax together, and they're in different orientations, and they've been deformed by different amounts. So when you actually deform a material, for example, in forming a piece of metal, you take that material out as formed. There are internal stresses within the material. In fact, some of those internal stresses will be very, very close to the yield strength, because you have to have a stress above the yield strength to get the grain to deform so that it relaxes itself. So if you just take a piece of material that you whack with a hammer, for example, and deform, and you look at that, then you have grains within that material which are right now under loads that are right at the yield strength, just not above it. I mentioned earlier that if you take a polycrystal and you begin to deform it, that you're really deceiving yourself if you think it doesn't start yielding until you get to the nominal yield strength. There are places in that material, unless you have done a fabulous job of annealing it and relaxing it, there are volumes, sub-volumes in that material that are right on the verge of yielding before you ever put a load on it. And that first load you put on it is going to cause some yielding somewhere in the material, some deformation of the whole material. In fact, you can show that if you have a whole bunch of grains, that the strain in the whole material, the strain you put in, is simply the average strain in the individual grains. So that's why, way back here at the beginning in a real material, you may not get much deformation. You're not going to really start deforming this thing until you've pretty much percolated plastic strain through all the grains, or at least significant sets of grains, so that you get long-range deformation. But at the very beginning, you start getting some deformation. And that's the reason that yielding in a polycrystalline structural material is not really a well-defined number. Why you have to have a definition of how you're going to define it. The yield strength, since these grains are randomly developed, the connection between the yield strength and the critical resolve shear stress is there. It's not that easy to calculate. There are really a couple of things that make it hard to calculate. One is that if you're going to deform this material macroscopically in an arbitrary way, you have to be able to take every irregularly shaped grain in the interior and deform it in a volume that's compatible with what's going on around it. Now, we talk about slip systems, which are a combination of a dislocation and a slip plane. And I'm not going to examine you on this, but just to tell you, in order to get arbitrary deformation of a grain, you have to have 5 slip systems acting in that plane. So it's not enough just to get slip going on the most favored plane. You've got to get slip going on 5 independent slip systems, 5 independent combinations of dislocation and slip plane in order to get a completely random deformation of that grain. So that means that you're going to need a stress that is significantly above the critical resolve shear stress in order to get that to happen. The computation of that has been done in various ways, and the conclusion gives a sigma y proportional to tau c by a factor kt, which is called the Taylor factor after the first guy who tried to calculate it. And that turns out to be about 3. So to a pretty good approximation, you can say the yield strength of a random polycrystal, particularly cubic material, is going to be about 3 times the critical resolve shear stress. And this relation works pretty well for most materials. Controlling the yield strength. Of course, what we would like to do is to be able to control plastic deformation. Since our main purpose in controlling plastic deformation, our most common objective, is to avoid it. We look at things that we can do to make the yield strength as high as possible. These are the microstructural mechanisms we can use to strengthen the material. And they fall basically into 3 categories. First is the crystal structure. You know that some things are much harder to deform than others, even if they're in single crystal form. You know, deforming glass is difficult, possible. Take a nanoindenter and you can make a nice little pit in window glass without breaking it. But it's difficult to do that. So the structure is one thing that's going to have an effect. The second thing we can do is define the grain size. It turns out the finer the grain size of the material, the higher its yield strength is. This is what's called the Hall-Petch relation, which gives us yield strength proportional to mean grain size to the -1/2, 1 over the root of grain size. So small grain size can lead to rather high strength. And this is in fact the way that the strength of, for example, normal structural steels is usually controlled by controlling the grain size. I'll describe it for you a little later. The third thing that we can do is within the grain we can introduce things that are obstacles or act as obstacles to the motion of the dislocations. These can be solute atoms. That's called solution hardening, and I sort of gave you an example of that in the titanium oxide. As we build up the oxygen content, the titanium becomes stronger. Other dislocations, work hardening, you kind of saw that happening as well. As we deform the material, the dislocations multiply, the dislocation density gets much, much higher. These dislocations get in each other's way, and as a consequence, the material becomes quite a bit stronger. That's what's called work hardening, and that's what's responsible for the increase in strength as the material strains in the plastic region. And finally, precipitates. We can introduce very small precipitates into the material and get precipitation hardening. Which of these we choose to use depends on what the material is, how effective they will be, what temperature range we're trying to operate in, and how difficult they are to do in terms of the manufacturing of the material. Let's go first to the crystal structure. if we look in the crystal structure itself, the elementary thing that must be done to move a dislocation is that, well, the dislocation is a line, so if you want the dislocation move, what usually happens is somewhere along the line, a little bulge will develop. The whole dislocation doesn't move forward at once. That would take a pretty high stress. You just get a little bulge developing, and it puts out a kink, and the kink then moves out along the line, and that causes the whole line to come forward. But we do have to move that little elementary piece of dislocation. And the stress that's required to do that is called the Piles-Navarro stress. Piles did it about 1940. Frank Navarro improved it in the late 40s. He passed away a couple of years ago in his late 90s. He spent a pretty little time here, actually. It was particularly his later years. He was at Berkeley quite a bit. Anyway, they computed a relation for this stress, which is the stress required to move a dislocation essentially by breaking local bonds and then reestablishing it. And the elastic solution of that gave rise to an equation here. I just had to correct this. I noticed there was an error on the slide that I've actually been using for a couple of years. I just corrected it. This is the correct form. The pile stress is 2. This is the shear modulus. Nu is Poisson's ratio. H is the distance between slip planes, and B is the Burgers vector. And here is just a plot for many materials of the, well, the notation's a little different. This is the stress to move a dislocation divided by the shear modulus as a function of H over B. So there are really two ways to make a material inherently strong. You give it a very high shear modulus, or you use the crystal structure to get a small value of H over B. And in terms of that, if we're down here looking at magnesium, some ionic materials, face-centered cubic materials, have very small dimensionless strengths. It's very easy to glide in these materials. They're close-packed materials, basically. A little higher, more difficult, are the BCC alloys. B2 is an ordered BCC structure, basically. A little higher, sodium chloride is a little harder to deform. It's up here. HCPs are in this region here. But then we get to things like silicon, aluminum, SiO2, covalently bonded materials, which have very small values of H over B, basically because the Burgers vectors in those materials, the structure is complicated. You need a big whopping Burgers vector to get the lattice to repeat itself. So you get these materials that have big natural Burgers vectors, and they tend to be very, very strong with respect to their moduli. Just by contrast, the ideal strength of the material depends on the crystal structure, but is of the order of about 10% of the shear modulus. So these materials here are very, very close to ideal strength before you can deform them plastically or remove a dislocation. So you have inherent materials. I mentioned to you earlier that when I was looking for a material, recommending a material to use for spring that would be predictable in its properties, even when the deformation was very small, I told them get rid of the body-centered cubic material, which is down here, and go instead to something like quartz, which is up here. Since these have such a high pile stress, it is very difficult to deform these materials at any low stress. As a consequence, these materials will truly remain elastic until you get a very high stress on them. Where these materials that have smaller theoretical strengths will accumulate internal stresses and tend to deform under relatively low stresses, at least a little bit. So if you want something that's really going to behave elastically, you want to be up in this region here, very high pile stress. For most metals, the pile stress is 10 to the minus 3 or lower with the shear modulus, and you can in fact ignore it. It makes virtually no contribution to the strength. One of the ways you can tell whether the pile stress is high or not, if you have a material with a high pile stress and you look at the dislocations, image the dislocations will tend to be very straight because it's very difficult for the dislocation to wiggle from one plane to another. In materials where that have lower pile stresses and are more ductile and more easily deformed, the dislocations are quite irregular, they're curved, they essentially are all messed up, kind of like you saw in the titanium example back here. You see these dislocations are very general in their shapes, and that's indicating the relatively low value of the pile stress in the material. If that were quartz instead or alumina or something like that, you'd see an almost dead straight dislocations in the material. Very hard to move. Okay, so one thing you can do is choose a material that has very high pile stress. What's wrong with that? Materials, we'll show this from a different perspective in a couple of lectures, but any material that has a very high pile stress is going to be brittle. The reason it's going to be brittle, be strong, but it's going to be brittle. And the reason it's going to be brittle is that the margin of safety, the thing that lets a material relax in the presence of a force without breaking, is plastic deformation. So if you take a material and you make it impossible for it to deform plastically, even under relatively high stresses, it's going to be brittle. So look at all these things up here. I mean, these are things you know to be brittle. Quartz, window glass, aluminum, these are brittle materials. The ductile materials are down here where the metals are. So most of the time, for structural materials, you don't want to use these things. They're strong, but they are not damage tolerant, and your device is quite likely to fall apart. So what else can you do? Well, one other thing that you can do is to control the grain size of the material. Now this is Takaki's famous plot, part of which he did when he was visiting here. The proof stress of steel is a function of grain size. It doesn't really matter that much whether you have BCC iron or FCC iron. You follow pretty much the same curve. As you go to smaller and smaller grain sizes, you see the strength takes off. This is 0.2 for commercial pure iron. You're up here at grain size of about 0.2 of a micron, and you're 1.6 GPa. You've multiplied the strength by a factor of 8, almost a factor of 10, simply by refining the grain size. So this is an enormous effect. And in fact, because it's easy to do, the way structural steels are manufactured, the way most structural steels have their strength controlled, is you're processing them, let's imagine what's called a hot strip mill. You're making sheet steel. So you start out with an ingot, you heat it up, you put it through various rollers, and each roller squashes it down a bit until it finally gets to the thickness you want to have for a car body or something of that sort. How do you control the strength? The easy way to control the strength, since you're at high temperature, when you deform it, it recrystallizes. Recrystallization is, with a little bit of Kentucky windage, a predictable phenomenon. So if you put it through a deformation, through a pair of these rolls to squash it down, you can do a pretty good job of predicting when it's going to recrystallize, at what temperature after that deformation it's going to recrystallize, how long it's going to take it to recrystallize. So you deform it, the sheet comes out from the roll, and it starts recrystallizing at a certain rate, so you know how long it's going to take it to recrystallize and the grains grow to a grain size you'd like to have, and you can translate that into distance ahead of the roll. So I can say, 15 feet ahead of the roll, the grain size is going to be this, 25 feet ahead of the roll, the grain size is going to be this, and so on. Then I do a clever device. I put a water table, which is nothing more than a spray. So 25 feet ahead of the roll, when another grain size has got me right here, I hit it with a spray, freezes the grain size, cools it, and then I have my material. And that is the actual way that the strength of most structural steels is, the kind of sheet steels and such things is actually controlled these days. Just using a thermomechanical processor, a rolling mill, for example, and a water table to quench it when recrystallization gives you the grain size you'd like to have. Well, why don't we just let this thing sheet on up? Why should we restrict ourselves to strengths down here? Why not do nanograins and just make really strong stuff? And there has been a lot of push in that direction by people who don't know much about what's going on because of the following. There's a trade-off. As I go down in grain size, the strength goes up, but the ductility goes down. And you see this is actually aluminum. This is Suya's plot out of Kyoto. He has a virtually identical one for steel, showing essentially the same thing. As we refine the grain size, you see the strength coming up here. But look what's happening to the elongation. It's coming down. And the reason is that when you refine the grain size, as we'll see in just a little bit, the strength is determined by the resistance to dislocation motion. The elongation is very strongly affected by the work hardening. How fast does the material work harden after the dislocations form? And the trade-off is such that it's almost automatically true that as you take the strength up, the ductility is going to come down. So you go trying to make some nanograin material, and yeah, you get real high strength, but the material is virtually useless because it has no ductility. It's not brittle in the sense that quartz is brittle, but it's practically brittle in the sense that you can't put any deformation in it without breaking it. So nanograin materials are pretty much out in structural materials. You want some intermediate grain size where you get a good combination of strength and ductility. And in particular, as I told you earlier, in the specification of structural materials, structural metals, it is very, very common for the customer, the user, to specify the strength ratio. Unless you can give them an ultimate strength which is sufficiently above the yield strength to give him a cushion, a safety factor in service, they don't want to use the material. So things that have stress strain curves look like this, they may look great from a strength point of view, but you're not going to find them in many structures because basically they're brittle materials. So we use the strength, the grain size to control strength, but we are generally shooting for an intermediate grain size, intermediate strength level to get the right combination between strength and ductility. Well, I'll finish there today, and on Friday we'll talk about the ways that we can use obstacles to dislocations within the grain to get the strength, and when we want to use these very strengthening mechanisms.